Welcome, students. Welcome to your University of Canterbury. Whether you're a student here now, whether you once were a student here, whether you might be a student in the future, in any way you look at it, this is your university. You pay the taxes, you're here tonight. It is your UC. So welcome. You ready to be entertained? Yes. Are you ready to be educated? Well, actually, that's kind of hard to do both of those things. It kind of makes me think of a road sign that I went past, the big billboards in the United States. I went past it on my way through Tennessee recently. You can go very fast on the American interstates. I think I caught it. It was for a veterinarian and a taxidermist. A few miles down the road, kilometers down the road, I think I got it. Either way, you get your pet back. 26 centuries ago, a fellow named Aristotle wrote a book called the Poetics. And in the Poetics, he said, in order for something to be truly art, it must do three things. It must be beautiful. It must be good, and it must be true. Well, you can come on a What If Wednesday in the future and then another one to look at whether things are ethical and whether they're beautiful. Today, we'll look at just one, whether it's true. In fact, the question we'll ask today is whether Hollywood gets history right, whether Hollywood understands the truth, and do movies, films, television shows produced by Hollywood in order to be beautiful, truly art, and good, must they also be true? So let's have a look today. What if Hollywood got history right? Well, have you been to a film lately? Right. Watched one on TV, rented one? Sure, everybody here, right? Well, when you go to a film, what are your expectations? My guess is with the popcorn and with the large Coke, right, the super-sized thing, you expect to have fun. You expect to be entertained. That's why we go to the movies on the whole, isn't that right? Romantic comedies, suspense, right? We go to have fun. Well, similarly, when you go to historical films, do you have the same expectations? Do you want to be entertained? Is there something else you want? Is it important if the movies gesture at truth, if they're accurate, if they're authentic? And some of you surely have gone to movies recently that you would call historical. Indeed, if you went to the best Oscar winner for this year, right, you would have seen 12 Years a Slave. There are lots of other movies that are strictly historical that Hollywood has put out recently. Why did you go? Did you expect to be entertained, or did you expect to be edified? And for edification, does something have to be true? Well, these are the questions that I think we'll look at today. All right, we're locked in. You can't leave now. You're stuck. And so the question I want to start with is, well, if I'm going to ask you, what if Hollywood got history right, does it matter? Does it matter if Hollywood gets it wrong? Would you still buy a ticket? Do you think you would be ripped off? Maybe you wouldn't go if Hollywood got it wrong. Well, I would say to you for sure, because directors and producers write about this, they're desperate to get you to come to the movies and to like the movies. And if they're historical dramas, then they want you to believe that they're both accurate and authentic. So certainly at the bottom line, it matters. So we know and love it when a story begins based on the truth. When a film starts with based on a true story, we have different expectations then, don't we? What if I told you, however, that, say, a movie that did very well, Matthew McConaughey was in it, called U-571, was so inaccurate as to be ludicrous? Would you still have gone? What if I told you that the movie, which is set in 1942, actually is based on a story, truth, from 1941. Would you care? No? Not at all? Wait a minute. Let's see, I'm American. It seems to me the Americans entered World War II in December of 1941. So if the movie is actually truthful, it would have to be before the Americans entered the war. So how could Matthew McConaughey or any Americans capture a German U-boat? How could they grab the Enigma machine and break the code? Oh, right, they didn't. It turns out it was in 1941, and it was the British, not the Americans, who did this. And while perhaps here in New Zealand we're equal opportunity English speakers, it doesn't matter. There were a lot of people in England, in the mother country, right, who were mighty upset about the inaccuracy of this movie. So maybe it does matter, or at least the illusion might matter a lot as well. We might similarly point out in the movie The Patriot, there's some real British bashing there, right? Turns out Tarleton, or the equivalent of Tarleton, Tavington, right, herds up patriots in a church, heaven forfend, and burns the church down. Did that ever happen in the American Revolution? No, nobody thinks it really did. Did it ever happen, say, in 1943? Did the Nazis perhaps do this? Yes. So it's wonderful if Hollywood can turn the British into Nazis. As long as things appear true. I particularly love the movie The Patriot because the sun sets over the Atlantic Ocean in South Carolina. It was different back then. Well, I was at Princeton University a while back, and Princeton's a quite wealthy place, so they can surprise you, and the students invited Martin Scorsese, the famous Hollywood director, to come have a chat with us. I managed to get into this and got to ask him a question. And my question was, in fact, about Hollywood and history. And he sort of gave me a sideways glance and a bit of a smirk and said, "Hollywood, getting history right. Do you go to McDonald's and expect them to improve the culinary tastes of the United States? Do you expect them to look after your cardiovascular health?" So why would you ask Hollywood to get history right? Hollywood's job is not protreptic. It's not propedeutic. It's not to teach anyone. It's to make money. We'll return to this in a little while, but I got the sense that Scorsese was being at least a little bit tongue-in-cheek. For many directors, including him, I think, getting history right has at least some meaning beyond the bottom line. Well, if it doesn't matter to Scorsese, if it doesn't matter to Hollywood generally, it matters to me. And I'm happy to tell you why. It does matter to me, genuinely. I'm an historian. I think that's the way we get to know ourselves. Some people think we do it previously, say, through theology, right? We're in the image of God. And it's through our soul we get to know ourselves, or something like that. Others might look to philosophy, right? The grand discipline of them all. And that looks for what the universal characteristics in us. You want to get to know who we are, you've got to find out what each and every and only humans are. Free, rational, featherless, biped, right? That's what we are. Historians like the particular. They like to look at people over time and in particular places and particular moments. It matters to me whether we get history right. Part of the reason is also because it matters to me as a teacher and a citizen and as a neighbor whether we get society right. Whether we relate to each other through morals and ethics or through something less. And so when you go to a movie, it always makes me think, wow, here's an opportunity. Especially because movies, lots of people go to movies, the opportunity to improve, to think about ethics, comes much more frequently watching the Rialto channel or going to Hoyt cinemas than it does, well, how many of you have recently picked up Kant's critique, third critique, and come and talked with each other? Hey, I've been reading about the categorical imperative. Now I know how to behave, right? You've been picking up St. Thomas Aquinas lately? You know the difference between divine law and human positive law? You've been working on that, right? That's going to make you a better, never, right? It's nonsense. That's not what we do. Reading the diary of Anne Frank, may make us relate to a 15-year-old, Jewish or not, and she's like us, right? We get sympathy. Or The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison that makes a black man become visible to us where he'd been invisible before. This improves us. This changes us. So if there are millions of people and millions of eyeballs watching movies, it matters to me if Hollywood gets its history right. Get what right, actually? That's a decent question to ask. Get what right? What do we mean by getting history right? Well, I think for many Hollywood directors, and I'll talk for a moment here about James Cameron, I think you can go visit, you can go ask him if I'm right? He lives in Masterton now or somewhere, so you can go up and visit him in the Wairarapa. For many directors, getting Hollywood's history right actually means more about getting it authentic, getting the costumes right, getting the scenes right, setting it. They're visual people, right? So they want the look and the feel of the picture to be right as much as anything else. In fact, people win Oscars for costume design. And indeed, one of the great Oscar winners was for the costume design of this great image behind me, right, of Gone with the Wind and Scarlett O'Hara's dress, right? This is what we look at. Is this accurate? Are the frills there? Is this what someone would have worn in 1861 in the American South? That's the kind of question directors often ask themselves. James Cameron famously insisted that historians find out what everything looked like on the Titanic, inside the Titanic, and rebuild it right. So the china, the place settings, the wallpaper. In fact, the story goes that they were building that grand staircase. I know you've seen this movie, Men too. You don't want to admit it, but you probably have, right? The grand staircase that they built, well, they were building it out of pine, and Cameron said, oh no. What was it made out of? It was made out of oak. You must build it out of oak. Because when we flood it and it sinks or floats, I don't know what wood does, I forget, right? It's got to float or sink like oak instead of pine. So when we're talking about Hollywood getting history right, in many ways this is their obsession. It's not so much about what I consider more important in history, which is about interpretation and perspective and the large, big picture of history. Then there are other questions that are interesting enough about getting history right. I'm writing about Abraham Lincoln, so I'm going to share with you what interests me a little bit, and I hope you too, about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a big man. He was 6'4", and of course he is a symbol of greatness, American leadership, American presidency, a big, famous politician, president. And so we associate that with what we've seen of him. This big statue in the Lincoln Memorial with Raymond Burr or Henry Fonda having played him in films in the 1920s and 1930s. We associate with Lincoln Sam Waterston, the actor, who's his voice over in the great Civil War series documentary by Ken Burns, right? So getting history right, we think of Lincoln having a stentorian basso voice. It's not true. No, it's just not true. In fact, he was born in Kentucky, and although he was a very big man, he had a very high-pitched voice. So when you combine a high-pitched kind of voice with being from Kentucky, my wife's family's from Kentucky, it's hard to understand them, right? They say strange things. So while we have no, don't repeat that. While we have no recordings of Abraham Lincoln, you know this, there are lots of folks who went and heard him. So when he first spoke in New York City, for example, in February of 1860, just about time to run for president, the first words out of his mouth at Cooper Union were to thank Mr. Chairman. And lots of people wrote in their diaries when they went home, wow, I wasn't expecting that. A great masterful speech, but he's got a very strange voice. So what did Steven Spielberg and Daniel Day-Lewis decide? They want Hollywood to get history right. So they decided that they were going to have Abraham Lincoln sound like, well, what they believed and understood Abraham Lincoln to sound like. And here, at the opening of this movie, Lincoln, we get Abraham Lincoln speaking for the first time. But pay attention to when.
Joined up with the 116th U.S. Colored, sir, from Camp Nelson, Kentucky. What's your name, soldier?
Private Harold Green, sir.
That's all I'll play for you. There, that's Lincoln's voice. How come he isn't in the frame? Very interesting. What Spielberg decided to do was to get it right. But then he had a problem. If you see Abraham Lincoln or Daniel Day-Lewis's rendition of him, remarkable verisimilitude, and hear that crazy voice, that twangy sort of high-pitched voice, I think they realized the audiences would reject it. They'd say, that's not possible. So what did they do? They wanted to get it right. They refused to get it wrong. So what they did was they have this opening scene where we pan around Lincoln as he's talking. So first we hear him, not at all in this, right? We don't see him at all. First we hear him. We get used to the voice as we pan around and finally see him. So that by the time we have a full frontal view of Abraham Lincoln here, we've already decided, okay, yep, this is his voice. So it's a very interesting thing to think about what it means to get history right. For audiences accustomed to what might be wrong, there are distinct challenges in making the decision to get it right. Quite a good movie, by the way, quite a good film, and you're welcome if you want to ask me about all the authentic and inauthentic parts later. I'm joking. Right? So this can go. Well, of course, Hollywood and history have a long history itself. And Hollywood, if nothing else, understands its place in the world, maybe too well. And so Hollywood, when it gets a chance, often makes fun of itself, turns in on itself, looks at itself. And Forrest Gump is one of those great movies, a great picture, very successful, earned hundreds of millions of dollars, earned Tom Hanks an Oscar, that plays fast and loose with history. But of course it does so self-consciously. Forrest Gump is all about telling us Hollywood's going to give you a version of history of its own. And let's not miss the point. There is within this movie definitive stories about us, about Americans, about living through the 1960s. But more than anything else, it's an attempt to have fun with history and Hollywood inside joke saying, hey, we can do what we want with celluloid stories, right? So one of the great stories here, or one of the great parts, of course, is what? Tom Hanks interjecting himself throughout history. I believe it is entirely true that Lyndon Baines Johnson never awarded the Purple Heart to Tom Hanks. Right? I'm willing to go on record on that, right? We're recording now. I'm quite confident that's true. High confidence there. But we all know this. The whole point was putting Tom Hanks or Forrest in these strange positions to make us almost stand outside and say, that's right, we know that didn't happen. We know it's wrong. And some of the ways we do this, or Hollywood does this, is most intriguing. Here we have, of course, an interview with Forrest Gump, and I guess he's coming after John Lennon, who was interviewed first here by Dick Cavett, right? You remember this great scene? Well, let's look at where this comes from. Who came up with this, and why? Well, be quick, ready? Here we go. You've already figured this out. It turns out, who do we got?
In Britain, we only have 2 channels of TV.
Nobody.
And if you watch the old British movies on about 3 new people.
That's right, Hollywood did it to me. They
in Britain, we only have 2 channels.
Well, now we have a green
TV.
screen. I can't explain it.
And if you watch the old British movies on TV
and who was
now
there?
here, it's the same old men
it
always
was
on
Yoko
TV
Ono.
in Britain still.
Right? So, in fact, they take something true. How do they do it? They just take Yoko Ono. It doesn't matter that it was John's wife, right? It doesn't matter that it was a female. We'll separate it out and we'll put Forrest Gump in here. Does Hollywood get history right? No, of course it gets it wrong. But the point here, I think, is for Hollywood to remind us, and I think they self-consciously are trying to remind us, look, we're playing with history here, right? And so don't expect in Gone with the Wind or in Full Metal Jacket or in Zero Dark 30 to have us get history right. At least not exactly. Well, that having been said, maybe this will work. I bring you to the opening few lines or moments in the movie Titanic. So what do we make of this? This movie stars Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio, two of the biggest stars in all of Hollywood. First of all, for James Cameron, it's a big risk to begin a movie without our leads, and then he has to find a way to get them, ingratiate them back into the narrative. So why does he choose to do this? Why does he begin with this? What's important here? Well, clearly, Cameron believes in one way or another that the movie-going experience gains value proportionally with credibility. And that if you don't believe that this is the Titanic, then why not change the name of the movie to Immense, right? Not a true story. It's just a romance, right? Because that seems not to do it for us. We didn't go to this movie just to find out that Kate Winslet will bear it all on her first date with, so clearly they're not getting history right there when it comes to mores. But the point here is this has great value. What Cameron wants us to do is understand and associate this love story with a true story, with the sinking of the Titanic. And when you separate them, the movie loses some vital element. The very marrow of the story seems to just disappear and dissipate. Indeed, you'll note that the movie then moves on to looking at the Titanic under the sea, right? So not only does Cameron give us fictive history to place us in a previous epoch, but then he gives us live history of the Titanic on the ocean floor. Well, wrong or right, Hollywood is obsessed with history. And we all love a good history, don't we? And we certainly vote with our pocketbooks when Hollywood seems to get history right, or perhaps wrong. This year, 12 Years a Slave won Oscar for Best Picture. If you look at this list, and I'm sure you are, you'll see everything from the story of Mozart and Shakespeare to Titanic to Forrest Gump among those Hollywood and Hollywood directors, and us by our pocketbook voting have decided are the best films made in Hollywood that year. History sells. Well, what about getting history right? Authenticity, accuracy, what about interpretation? This is something I know a little bit about, and we're not going to get into too much epistemology today, right? You don't sit around the breakfast table talking epistemology, do you, very often? So we're not going to do it here. Epistemology, it's just a little talk about how we know, a little bit of knowing talk. And what we might say is very few people today would argue that you go to an historian and they're going to get history right. And when they mean getting it right, they mean that actually this is what had happened. So we go back and we know exactly what happened and we can repeat it for you. Historians shy away from that. In fact, I would suggest to you that scientists and social scientists, together with those in the humanities, shy away from thinking there's an out there absolute truth which we can stamp as right, prime, and move on to something else. In history, it's especially difficult because history, by understanding, is something that happened in the past. You can't interview the witnesses. They're gone. And if you do interview eyewitnesses, say from several hundred years ago, as I often tell my students, don't tell anyone, right? They'll throw you in the nut house, right? We can't interview them. History, by definition, then, is indirect. History as well, since we depend on sources, is incomplete. You never have all the sources. You never have all the stories. What's more than that, history must be structured. That is, somehow or other, if you're telling a story, it must have a beginning and a middle and an end, and it must be connected to some larger things. Well, where does that structure come from? It comes from us. And of course, the us I'm talking about are humans. And we have our own interests and values. So yes, I'm writing a book about Abraham Lincoln. Maybe I'll get him right or wrong. But the fact that I'm writing about Abraham Lincoln and not about, say, Jefferson Davis, or about Frederick Douglass, or Stephen Austin Douglas, or Lydia Maria Child is, I hope, not because I'm racist or sexist or anti-Southern, but because in one way or another, I think Lincoln is worthy of study. Well, that's my value. And all history, because people choose to write and not write, study and not study must be value-laden. So all of history is incomplete, indirect, value-laden, and structured. There's no way around that. Therefore, ultimately, what we're saying is, who gets history right? Well, no one really argues that we get history right. What we bring to it is a perspective. And what we can do is interrogate, ask about the kinds of perspectives people bring to history and the evidence they bring to bear to show that they are, how shall we say, on the right track. Fair enough? Well, is there a Hollywood perspective? How's that? That's a fair question, and I would say there certainly is. But before we go very far, I have to take one step back, particularly as an American lecturing here, chatting with you folks here in New Zealand, to remind ourselves that not all movies are made in Hollywood. Right? Not all movies are made in the United States. Hollywood we take as a metonym. It stands in for something else. So when someone says Wellington declares war, I trust they don't mean that the city somehow has found a voice, right? It's standing in for something, or the beehive. So when we're saying Hollywood, right, it's standing in. For what? Is there a Hollywood perspective? Well, there might be. If what we mean is decidedly American, Hollywood, last I checked, is in California, which technically, at least, I hate to admit it, is part of the United States. I have to be careful of that, though. I'm a New Yorker. And at least before 9/11, New York was never considered part of the United States. Hollywood is a multi-billion-dollar industry. In fact, for much of my youth, Hollywood was the second biggest grossing earner abroad for the United States. What was the first biggest earner? General Motors. Wrong. Sorry, Toyota passed General Motors sometime in the 1980s even. Oil, no. The United States is not allowed to export its oil. It's actually not allowed to export it. It could. It should. It should export natural gas to the Ukraine. That would certainly change things a little bit. Sorry. Yes. Arms, no, I like that too. Wall Street, believe it or not. No wonder we have a global financial crisis, right? No politicians in America, I've gone off subject here. No politicians in America wanted to shut down Wall Street because it was the greatest export industry. Believe it or not, high finance made a lot of money. Anyway, Hollywood was second, and Hollywood earns billions of dollars. Wall Street a lot less now. So American, capitalist, profit-seeking. Often in America, we ask whether a state is red or blue, whether it's Republican or Democrat. Well, I would suggest that asking whether Hollywood is Republican or Democrat, though that's a fair answer, is probably the wrong way of looking at it. It's an industry, it's capitalistic, it's imperial, and its color is green. But Hollywood doesn't trade in McDonald's burgers or fries or Merrill Lynch Capital or ExxonMobil oil. It trades in culture. Hollywood is a filmmaker. Directors and producers in Hollywood make movies. And movies have perspectives. And those perspectives are important. Hollywood creates tastes. But it doesn't only do that. It also reflects them. So we can look at movies, and I'm going to suggest we do that for at least a little while tonight. You can go home and look at more of these yourselves, right? Don't be afraid. It reflects Americans' tastes. So if we look at, say, America, and we're going to do this in 4 brief eras, I think we'll find in the movies cultural evidence, cultural artifacts of a time, a mood, a presence from Hollywood's perspective. But equally, and equally importantly, Hollywood movies and films also create culture, right? They create attitudes. People go to the movies and they associate what they see in movies with history and truth, and therefore they change. So let's take a few examples, right, and cash this in. The movie that I want to first discuss is probably one of the movies that many in Hollywood would consider one of the greatest films of all time. The greatest of the silent pictures. Also one of the first great pictures. The first picture ever screened in the White House by a Southern president, by the way, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, in the 1915 Birth of a Nation. By Aristotle's terms, this is not art. It may be beautiful. It may be true. It's not. But it's also evil. In many ways, this birth of a nation is not the birth of any nation. It's the birth of what? The Ku Klux Klan. And this movie is made at the time of segregation. A time of segregation in which black children and white children went to separate schools, in which blacks and whites drank out of different water fountains, used different latrines, were buried in separate cemeteries, as in death as in life, were separate playgrounds. Indeed, if you testified in court, there was a Jim Crow Bible for the blacks and another Bible for the whites. This was an era of segregation, and this movie reflected that particular moment, sadly, in American culture. Birth of what? Birth of the Ku Klux Klan. This is really what it's about, or the birth of the redemption from Reconstruction after the Civil War. And alas, this is also a creator of myth, a creator of history, and a creator of, well, a recreation, one might say, a reprise of the Ku Klux Klan, which has a rebirth in the 1920s. An untoward, sad, if not evil, chapter in American history. Hollywood movies are powerful things. Gone with the Wind. Now we can talk about something a little more frilly and fun, but Gone with the Wind, made from a Margaret Mitchell novel. I believe it's produced in 1939, is also in its own way a racist movie. The racist stereotypes here are less about half-naked black lawmakers voting themselves fried chicken and watermelon. I kid you not, that is in Birth of a Nation. But nevertheless, gives a false impression, one would think, of race relations and the nature of the American Civil War. Here, Hollywood gets it very wrong. For Hollywood, in Gone with the Wind, we have the story, of Southern nationalism. We have the story of Southerners defending a way of life, that includes African Americans, slaves, who are loyal, who are hardworking, who are innocent, and who are oh so happy in their work, right? And of course we get this famous, strange story of this great Hollywood movie, Gone with the Wind. I can't find very many men who admit to having watched all of this movie, right? Gone with the Wind, in which Hattie McDaniel strangely, remarkably, wins the Oscar, the first African American to win an Oscar. And yet she cannot attend the movie opening in Georgia because of segregated sentiment. For many Americans, for generations, I would say, of Americans, Gone with the Wind is the story of the American Civil War. It's always interesting to have students constantly come and say, but really it wasn't so bad. Really it was the war of northern aggression. Really blacks were happy in slavery. And my answer is always, well, yeah, I get it. Yeah, I'd be happy too if I could be legally raped and my children could be sold anytime. That makes me happy. As we move on, and look a little bit later into the 1940s, we know about the coming of the Second World War. And Hollywood actually has its part in this. A very interesting chapter in Hollywood's history is that, well, many in Hollywood moved from the East Coast, have a Jewish background, Jewish descent, the Warner Brothers being one of the most famous. They helped build these studios, and they, perhaps more quickly than, say, some of their non-Semitic brethren, catch on to the nature of Hitler and the racial anti-Semitic ideology behind the Third Reich. Maybe they read Mein Kampf, few others did. And for the Warner Brothers, it's a great struggle then to think how to use Hollywood, to use the propaganda, the ability to create sentiment and taste to prepare America for the Armageddon that would be World War II. Because as many of you know, America was, more than an ocean away from joining World War II. Americans, America's firsters, right, were aloof. And so what do the Warner Brothers do? They decide to make a movie. One of the great movies of the era called Sergeant York. Not about World War II, but about World War I. And in making this film, they try to tell moviegoers who love the film, who are moved by it, that some wars are just, fighting wars are right, and that Americans do the right thing when they choose the right side, even if it means risking their lives by going to war. And America does go to war, ultimately. I don't think it's Sergeant York and Gary Cooper that gets us into the war. I think it's Yamamoto and the attack on Pearl Harbor. We'll leave Tora for another discussion of Hollywood and history. But the United States does go to war, and in the war, Hollywood becomes now part of the war effort. Everything from Ronald Reagan, right? You remember him, he becomes president of the United States. He doesn't go to war, he makes war propaganda. Frank Sinatra goes to war in Hollywood. He famously stars in a movie called The House I Live In. And I want to show you a little clip from that because it turns out there's some history behind this Hollywood story. Ready? Yes, that's Frank Sinatra.
Place I work in, the worker at my side, the little town or city where my people lived and died.
Have a look when the camera
The howdy and the handshake, the air of feeling free, and the right to speak my mind out. That's America to me. The things I see.
I'm sorry. It gets me every time. Well, we should note that there's a backstory here. Beautiful sentiments, right? And indeed, Frank Sinatra comes in as a bit of a hero because the children are picking on one of their own who's of Jewish background, and he brings them all together and says, come on, the house we live in is big enough for all of us. It's a wonderful uprising story about goodness, about poor and wealthy, Jewish and Gentile, living together in the house, America, that we've built. But what if I told you that the folks who wrote this actually wrote it about race? And that the story is a black child who's being picked on, and in comes Frank Sinatra and rescues the black child and says, not only are we one religion of many religions, e pluribus unum, but we're also many races that make up the Americans. And Hollywood decided that was too risky. We weren't ready for that yet. They weren't going to do that, and they painted out a black child and made that movie. So Hollywood makes choices. Hollywood makes choices in the way it addresses its reflection of culture and its creation of taste. When we move into the 1950s, we get some different stories, and we best move along pretty quickly if we're going to make it up to the 2000 and teens. I'm not going to talk about Lucy and Desi Arnaz very much, except to suggest what is the connection of Lucy and James Dean, with I Love Lucy and Rebel Without a Cause. And that would be a great final exam. So I'll send you on your way. Please make that connection. Can you? Well, of course you can. If you think about Hollywood and its part in helping Americans feel good about themselves, about the emerging liberal consensus of 1950s Cold War America. And one of the great challenges is to point to American cultural change and then grab it and sort of stroke it in such a way that it becomes manageable and maybe suitable for reform, but not revolution. One of the great stories in America is we had our revolution in 1776. One is enough. Now we only reform ourselves. We never need another revolution. New Zealand hasn't had one yet. You may still be thinking, let's get rid of the queen on the currency, right? Americans do it in 1776. So just as race is too risky an issue for the house I live in for Hollywood producers and directors, so women's rights, challenging gender. The emerging feminist movement gets expressed by Lucy, right? Isn't Lucy never happy to be home, right? She always is out going to do something, right? She's going to find a job. She's going to go do something. She's going to stomp some grapes. Whatever it is, right? Always challenging the norm. But how does every show end? Doesn't every show end, though, where, oh, Desi loves her, right? And she comes home, and ultimately, it's a happy family. So she manages to sort of express herself. There is a challenge, there is a subplot here, but it seems to be containable and expressible within the patriarchal, Freudian, happy family romance of husband, wife, 2 children, a dog, a cat, or 2.4 children, or whatever the exact is. Rebel Without a Cause actually has a similar type theme, right? The 3 protagonists here, right? They move off. They're enemies with their parents, right? They're fighting with their parents. One of the scenes that few remember that's most remarkable comes right at the beginning.
You know what kind of drunken brawls those parties turn into. It's no place for kids.
A minute ago, you said you didn't care if he drinks. He said a little drink.
You're tearing me apart!
What?
You say one thing, he says another, and everybody changes back again!
Girls don't love their father. Since when? Since I got to be 16?
Stop that!
Right, so we have what, the young boy, the young girl, and clearly there are fundamental problems in the family, right? The family structure is falling down. There seems to be great problems here, and they move off, right, the 3 of them, and they begin their own household, right? They create their own one. The result is catastrophic, it's death. But in the end, right, we have an attempt to come back into the household, right? To find father, to find mother, and perhaps bring back together, under one roof, the basic core elements that make up the family, the community, the core of a liberal consensus 1950s United States, right? So Hollywood experimenting with new ideas, but always with the idea of what? Making money and serving as an American iconic industry containing revolution, containing change, even as it gives us titillating hints of what we might want to see on the screen that challenges some of the status quo. Well, as we move into the 1960s, of course, Hollywood's going to reflect much greater turbulence, much greater change. The 1960s in America, I trust you all know, was an era of great unrest. The seeds might have been sown in the 1950s with, Pat Boone or whatever in his white shoes. They certainly come to fruition and become full-grown challenges to authority and American ideology in the 1960s. Similarly, we get movies like Dr. Strangelove. Think about this. What an interesting risk. And by the way, this movie is only so much Hollywood, so much Stanley Kubrick, who is a unique maverick genius, platonic director, maybe the greatest director of his time. A Cold War comedy in which the joke is on us when we have doomsday at the end of the movie. What could be more fun, right? What could be funnier than having a fight in the war room, right? Gentlemen, you can't fight, it's the war room. So this notion of challenging Cold War liberal consensus, of looking into and asking questions about what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, and doing it in the most subversive of all ways, as I think Aristotle would agree, by comedy. Similarly, we get the movie Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie and Clyde truly plays fast and loose with history. In fact, if you want to know about the truth of Bonnie and Clyde, the movie, then you should look for the girlfriend of Machine Gun Kelly. She was the radical who was able to say, or she says, here Hollywood puts into the mouth of Bonnie Parker, right? Hey, there's your gun. Are you willing to use it? I think we all get the innuendo there. In fact, Hollywood not only gets the Bonnie and Clyde story wrong, but they turn Bonnie Parker into essentially a 60s kind of feminist radical, where that was anything but the case in the actual history. What's more, Hollywood airbrushes, whitewashes, you choose the term you want, out Clyde Barrow's homosexuality or his bisexuality. They decide that the menage a trois doesn't fit for modern America. So what do? They make him instead impotent, right? Right? He's not a real true lover boy, he says. Right? And that's sort of the great story and tragedy as we glorify, in some sense, 60s violence and radical counterculture as heroic. Indeed, the great sadness in the way, the great moving feature of Beatty and Dunaway's performance in Bonnie and Clyde, which Beatty helped to produce, is that, of course, he overcomes his sexual impotency only at the moment where they decide not to rob banks and meet their horrible end. And, of course, it is that violent, horrible end, that shoot 'em up, that made the movie infamous and notorious and made Hollywood millions of dollars. Well, let's talk a little bit about another challenge, and that is the challenge of portraying in the 1960s the American military. One can do it by comedy, but what about by history? What about biography? And while many of you may not have seen lately or ever the movie Patton, it is an extraordinary movie and an extraordinarily difficult one to bring to the screen. In fact, they replaced screenwriter after screenwriter after screenwriter. Do you know who ultimately got the screenwriting credit for this movie? Turns out he made the movie Apocalypse Now and a whole bunch of other movies. You're done? You've had enough. Your brain is full. My brain is full. Can I be excused? Anyway, where are we? Yes, so the movie Patton. Quickly, let me show you a little bit about this. So how do you make a movie of Patton? Well, in many ways, in the introduction, in the trailer, Hollywood addresses precisely the problem of, in the 1960s, doing a biography or a biopic of someone who in many ways represents everything most Americans now find difficult to take, even reprehensible, in George S. Patton, and on the other hand trying to portray what? An American army that, at least in World War II and marching across Europe, is on the side of good. What a great challenge, even a paradox the character of Patton is.
Now, I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country.
This is Patton, a salute to a rebel, a man whom the New York Times described in an editorial 2 days after his death as a legend, spectacular, swaggering, pistol-packing, deeply religious and violently profane, a strange combination of fire and ice.
Well, there we go. So there we are trying to resolve this. So very interesting look at trying to understand and make accurate historical movie. The fact that I chose that opening scene, by the way, don't worry, we're moving on to another movie, The Smell of Napalm, yes. The opening scene, right, they have Patton give that speech, and of course he's wearing his full military dress, including what? 3 stars. Well, that's interesting because he gets those stars much later in the war. So accuracy doesn't always have to come down to every detail, I guess, right? And indeed, for many Americans, they associate George Patton with George C. Scott. Not with the high-pitched kind of strange General Patton, but with that man, George C. Scott, in such a stunning performance. All right, so we best move on out of the 1960s, or you're not going to have a chance to get to the end. Hollywood then goes on and deals with Vietnam. And in Vietnam, and Vietnam War movies, now I'll cover a few more topics after this, we see something that we have to remind ourselves about, which is history changes. It does, because historians change. And we get more history. And so we have new perspectives. The great philosopher Hegel said the owl of Minerva only spreads its wings at dusk. That is, only at the end of something might we know exactly what it means. And since history doesn't seem to end, we change our interpretations with our perspectives. And so Vietnam is one of those great ways to have a look at the way Hollywood deals with history. From the super patriotic movie The Green Beret, right, in the middle of the 1960s, which celebrates America coming and protecting the world for liberty, for republicanism. Whenever you have John Wayne in the movie, you know he's on the side of good. And so we have Vietnam, but in Vietnam, really, we just have a reprise of what? The American Western. He gets out of Stagecoach, and the next thing you know, he's at Quai Son border, or something like that. And indeed, the song from the Green Beret, everybody knows that song, right? Highly patriotic, stirring song. And even the beret itself, that wonderful cap, right? Who wouldn't want to wear that? A great symbol of America doing the right thing, and the American military there to ensure that the American way is spread throughout the world. What a contrast then with Full Metal Jacket, where we have, right, the colonel coming up to our friend Joker and saying, why are we in Vietnam? We are in Vietnam because inside of every gook there is an American trying to get out. I find it doesn't go over well in class if I say inside every New Zealander there's an American trying to get out. On the whole, I don't know why. That hasn't really worked for me. Right, so quite a change. So as Americans go through the Vietnam experience and come to reflect on it in new ways, that this isn't another American Revolution, this isn't World War II, but this is a dubious, questionable overreach by the United States into a place it doesn't know, then Americans change their views, and Hollywood both reflects these changes and I think helps to create a sense of what the American experience in Vietnam was. So we get movies like Platoon and Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now is the application of Joseph Conrad's, the Polish English-speaking writer, Heart of Darkness, and put into Vietnam. What an extraordinary and strange thought. What does it have in common with Platoon and many other Vietnam movies? Unlike most war movies, there's no objective. There's no grand plan. There are no generals. There's no looking and saying, well, what are we doing here and how does it relate to last month and how does it relate to this bridge too far or to D-Day or taking a capital. So the Vietnam movies become movies about the nature of war. They become movies about the nature of human relations within the war as opposed to being about the American purpose and objective, which becomes, as it slips away and drifts into nothingness, a scathing indictment of a great country that says, why is America in Vietnam? America's in Vietnam. Why not? And alas, that won't do. Of course, we get the inverse as well. I have here First Blood. It turns out if you see this movie, right, we were wrong. Hollywood got history right here. We won. It turns out the Americans won the Vietnam War. Thank you, Sylvester Stallone. Now, we have to start moving toward the finish line here, and I want to come to Full Metal Jacket and suggest, if I can here, something that I had hinted at before, which is we will leave out Colonel Kurtz here, which is that Hollywood understands itself. Hollywood reflects on itself. Hollywood thinks that Hollywood is so important that in itself, it's part of history. And so in many places, right, as in Forrest Gump, Hollywood makes comments about how it, in fact, is the chronicler, the storyteller, the historian. And so we put in movies, often as not, the moment of the cameraman, the director, observing or making the story, or both. And so we have in Full Metal Jacket, again, an amazing picture, in my view, by Stanley Kubrick. This scene in Way City.
You ready? Turn over. Place of the interviews, roll 34.
Well, like you see, it's a major city, so we have to assault with tanks. We roll in the streets, so they send us in first, the squad, make sure that there are no Vietnamese waiting with B-40 rockets to blow the tanks away. So we clear it out and we roll the tanks in, basically blow the place to hell. Was 8,000 or 10,000 miles around the world to do a job that Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves.
Personally think they don't really want to be involved in this war,
And we're not supposed to see them. But of course we get interview after interview, and then of course we break to green screen. But we break to a moment where what? Suddenly it's seemingly fighting again. But it turns out what? It's being staged. We have these folks who need newsreel footage, and so they have them. And so we have this strange notion of people actually in a war, but also know that they're being filmed, and what that might mean for how they behave and how they act. Well, these are interesting questions that Hollywood self-consciously, I think, likes to probe. Well, as we move through the 1970s and into the 1980s, in many ways, American society begins to fracture. It's not as violent, it's not as obvious, it's not as in your face as the 1960s, but Hollywood still finds itself obsessed with looking at American history and rewriting it, and finding in it sometimes conspiracy outright, like JFK, where it turns out Spiro Agnew and everyone was in on the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Only the Kennedy family, I think, didn't know. I particularly enjoy everyone who tells me about the conspiracy of 9/11. That's one of those things that really makes me absolutely lose control of myself. That's right. It's a conspiracy so vast that hundreds of thousands of people knew about it, and the United States government did it to itself. For what reason? Well, if the government's so powerful that it can do that and no one finds out, then why do they need to do it if they have all the power in the world already? Hollywood can get away with it. You can't. And so we have, of course, great movies, really fine movies with great actors, All the President's Men, in which what? We get a challenge or critique of American society, right? Of the corruption in the executive branch, leading to, in fact, the resignation of the president for having obstructed justice, for having committed great crimes. And here Americans look at themselves and see themselves soiled, and Hollywood wants them to. They want to tell the truth, but they also want to rescue us, right? They also want to say, but you have the Fourth Estate, you have the press, you have the means to clean yourself, to cleanse yourself of your own sins. So the good guys in the press can come in and rescue us from the bad guys in politics with the big noses. Little Big Man retells the story of the Western, right, as a comedy in which we have Little Bighorn and Custer sending himself to his own doom, not because of tragedy, but because of idiocy, foolishness, and arrogance. A whole new story of American Western expansion. In Syriana, not a favorite movie of mine, of course, right? The CIA is deeply involved in corruption. In fact, everybody is dishonest. The only honest person in the entire movie is the Hamas terrorist. Even for me, that's stretching it. So Hollywood trying to get history right, struggling with interpretation, but still obsessed with accuracy. How much so? When All the President's Men was made, the producers and directors decided, they insisted that they wanted to recreate the Washington Post newsroom exactly as it was, and they actually had flown in waste paper basket trash from the newsroom and brought that and put that in the trash cans in Hollywood. I kid you not, right? So trying desperately to be as accurate as possible and worrying a little bit less about perspective than about story. Well, finally, I'm going to end up tonight quickly talking about race. And again, here we find a little bit like the American military, a little bit like reflecting on Vietnam, that Americans have changed. And most people would say Americans have changed for the better. And Hollywood reflects this, and I would think directors like Steven Spielberg and Edward Zwick would also like to think that they helped change it. And Hollywood, in many ways, has been very progressive on the issues of race. The movie Glory, a singularly excellent war movie that takes the perspective in many ways of African Americans. African Americans who fight in the American Civil War for their own reasons. And not for all one reason, but for multiple reasons. But then again, to make it palatable for an American audience, which still struggles to this day with race, despite a black president. We have it told through the narrative eyes and voice and letters, of course, of the commander who's above them, who's white, Robert Gould Shaw. And so while we have in 1989 a new version of history, it turns out it's an awful lot like the Gowden's Relief that we see made in 1889, or virtually 1889, that you see in Boston to this day. Nevertheless, a very interesting and able movie that gets history wrong and right. Massachusetts 54th, how many slaves were in it versus how many free blacks? Overwhelmingly, it was free. Was there a Frederick Douglass type in that? Was there? No. They get it wrong. Was there a trip? Surely not. But nevertheless, gesturing at some new perspective, at the perspective of African Americans, and particularly the perspective of African Americans fighting in a war. To my mind, this is absolutely spot on. If you want to understand the great changes in America that lead to the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, and I know you all do. I know you're dying to know all this, but out of the American Civil War, there was no better place to start and end than with Abraham Lincoln, who is someone who is not an abolitionist, who has little contact with whites who have contact with blacks, has virtually no contact with blacks. There are only 800 free blacks in all of Illinois. But comes to the White House and discovers, more than anything else, the remarkable patriotism of white America fighting in a war. And of course, after January 1st, 1863, while some whites don't fight, he says, African Americans do. They fight. And they give their lives for their country. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, right? To have a more patriotic love of country. In my interpretation, and again, this is my perspective, that more than anything else changes Abraham Lincoln. He's president. He's sending people to their deaths. That they go and they die says everything. It says we were wrong. These are men, and they love their country. All right, so finally, we get to the age of Obama. And of course, in these very recent movies, I think we see some of the interesting challenges that Hollywood faces and Americans face in trying at the same time to use a capitalistic medium, right? To use film that both reflects and creates taste, that both is seeking profit. And if you're not seeking profit, you're not American, right? Right? You're just in the wrong country somehow, right? And the wrong epoch. That nevertheless, in its search to support an industry that is at the heart of capitalistic America, it both challenges norms and reinforces our own preconceived needs to say, America, full of problems, full of corruption, full of decadence and racism, and yet with the capacity, the institutions, the wherewithal, the good, the people, to fix its own problems. So in the age of Obama, we get an Abraham Lincoln, who is no radical, but ends slavery. We get 12 Years a Slave, in which the whites are abhorrent, in which the brutality of slavery is in almost every single scene. It's an extraordinary movie. But still, whites can feel good even if they hate Epps and don't want to relate to him. They can certainly relate to, well, Brad Pitt. Who wouldn't? I relate to Brad Pitt. who deus ex machina, right, suddenly appears an abolitionist, albeit from Canada, who there he is, ready to rescue the black slave, right? So we've got something for everybody. In the movie The Help, of course, we have, again, the similar kinds of problems. Hollywood is The Help. It's an isomorphic relationship in which at the same time we have folks struggling to express the grave challenges of segregation. And how do they do it? They do it on celluloid. They do it in a film that mocks us, that in some sense tells us, really? And so the way to end segregation, the way to end racial problems, the way to end all problems is for all of us to find a really cheery Skeeter white woman. And if she only writes the right letters, if she only attends the bake sale, right? If she only works with the PTA, everybody in America will come out perfect. Thank you very much.